Okay. Okay, hi there, everyone. Let's see who we have here today. Okay. Oh, wow, we have so many people here. Fantastic. Fantastic, guys. Right. So, hi, and thank you for joining us. I'd love to know where you are from, and if you are one of our italki teachers, what you teach on italki. So please comment in the chat so I can get to know you a little bit better. Now, to get started and to get to know me a little better, do you have any ideas what the numbers represent? Please type in the chat box and we can see how close you are. Okay, let's have a look at some of the comments. Okay, we've got someone from Turkey and we've got someone from South Africa. Hello hello home. And wow, Germany and Japan. And we've got someone from Germany who teaches Spanish. Wow. And let's see. Someone from Southern Russia teaching English and italki. Fantastic. British italki teacher teaching English and French, living in Indonesia. Fabulous. And Chris from the UK, living in Italy. Wow. And Iran and Australia. Oh, wow. Brazil. Okay, fantastic, guys. Now, do you have any idea what those numbers represent? Fantastic. I love this interaction. All right. So what do the numbers mean? Okay, so the 28th is my birthday. 2,420 are the number of lessons that I've completed or I've taught on italki, and I would say that 95% of them have been for test preparation. 2 is the number of kids that I have. Now, guys, when you see the little red speech bubble, top left-hand corner, your interaction and your comments would be appreciated so that we can have a dynamic, interactive webinar where teaching and learning take place, because I want to hear what you guys have to share with me. So moving on, I was born and bred in South Africa. I've traveled extensively across Europe, parts of South America, and Asia. I love traveling and engaging with new cultures. That's probably one of the reasons why teaching online gives me such joy. You really never know who you're going to interact with next. And while you're teaching, you're learning about foreign lands and cultures, traditions, and my favorite, superstitions. So all of us here who are teaching online and on italki are truly lucky to be able to engage with authentic learners who are our windows to strange and interesting worlds. Now, I've taught in China and in Turkey for renowned institutes, and I've taught at Wall Street English as a VIP teacher in Shenzhen and in Turkey. I've taught all ages, including teeny tiny kids when I was in Changchun. And I have to say, I just love teaching. Now, test prep is my forte. I love IELTS and PTE. So if we have any other test prep teachers in the house today, please comment. I'm results driven, and I make no excuses for that, which is why this webinar on assessing and monitoring students is really close to my heart. On a lighter note, I'm a Formula One fan, like go Ferrari. I've just taken up painting and I enjoy my summers in Italy where I usually clock up about 300 kilometers walking around the lake, but I still manage to put on weight. Italian food, what can I say? Okay, guys. Now, on a more serious note, let's take a look at today's webinar on assessments. We will look at the why we assess, the how, probably the most difficult part, and the reasons why we don't assess. In addition, we will analyze a speaking sample by a C1, C2 student using the methods that we are going to explore in this webinar. Most importantly, I will show you how to do assessments without losing class time. And I think that is a major issue. You don't want to eat into class time. We're going to talk about this later. And last but not least, we will go through methods we can use to assess reading, writing, and listening so that all 4 skills are addressed in this 90-minute webinar. But having said that, the sample test will be for speaking. So I really do hope that you are able to stay to the end when we will try and I will try and offer informed answers to any questions you may have. And I really look forward to any input and suggestions. Now, let's take a minute to look at this quote. And do you agree or disagree? If you disagree, how would you amend the quote to reflect effective teaching and learning? It says learners need endless feedback more than they need endless teaching. Your input and insights are really invaluable in helping us and other teachers to create classes which better cater to students' needs. So please, if you could comment in the chat, all right? Do we have any comments? Okay, Eric agrees. Anyone else? Okay, we've got teachers from all over the place. All right. Then let's move on. Right, now let's look at why students need to be assessed and why we have to convince them that getting assessed in the classroom, out of the classroom, and with italki's True North test is really in their best interest. And believe me, we do have to convince them. It's because having students demonstrate or show their understanding of the subject matter, what is being taught, is critical to the learning process. It's essential to evaluate whether the educational goals and standards of the lessons are being met. And also, assessments inspire us to ask the hard questions. Are we teaching what we think we are teaching? Yeah, think about that for a minute. And is learning taking place? Are students learning what they are supposed to be learning? And is there perhaps a way to teach the subject better, thereby promoting better learning? In my opinion, assessments allow us to up our game, thereby promoting accelerated learning, okay? Now, students need to be assessed, and I think the onus falls on us as teachers to convince students that testing and assessing is as important as learning. When we assess students, we are making sure that they hit their targets or they reach their goals before moving on to the next step. This is really important. Moving forward, when the student is not ready, will stunt or derail their learning journey. Very often, I have students who claim to have scored band 6.5, so they now want to score band 7. But that 6.5 actually only occurred once and maybe 3 or 4 years ago. Now, if I were to start at 6.5 when the student's true north is only 5.5, as a teacher, I would be teaching above the student's real level. The student will struggle, and so will I as a teacher. So sadly, for both parties, this would likely lead to failure, and that's the last thing that we want. So as guides, mentors, and supporters, it's our duty as teachers to ensure that our students reach their goals. They cannot assess themselves, only we can assess them. And do we really want to be tearing our hair out, teaching idioms and third conditionals to a student who is actually pre-intermediate? The same applies for teaching material that's too easy for a student. The student will be bored and may even decide to find a new tutor. Now that we have understood the why, let's move on to the how and the different types of tests. We have the diagnostic test, such as the italki True North test, formative and interim tests, and finally the summative test. And if you're thinking that the formative and the interim tests are pretty similar, you would be correct. Both are focused on progress, while the diagnostic test shows us the starting point. Have any of you used diagnostic tests? If you have, please comment in the chat. And the summative test at the end of the course indicates whether the student has understood and actually mastered the material covered. So is the student ready to climb the next rung of the ladder? You know, not being fully prepared for the next stage with gaps in learning will hamper a student's progress and lead to frustration. And all of this, unfortunately, comes from experience where I have dealt with students and made these mistakes, assuming that the student understood or I've taken those students' word that that's their true level. So, for example, an A2 student who is not capable of using past tense seamlessly is not ready to move on to the perfect tense, correct? So imagine trying to teach a student how to use perfect continuous when they are still confused about the past simple. Both you and the student will be going bananas. Right. Now that we are aware of the 4 types of tests used to assess students, let's discuss how often they should be done. And more importantly, how often you as a teacher does them. So please comment. Is it always, usually, or never? I'm going to have a look in the comments. Okay, Walter always uses a diagnostic test. Okay, it can depend on what kind of arrangement. Okay. Okay. Informally, okay. Only when the student asks for it? Okay. Almost never. So lots of reviews. Okay. Okay, so if you have beginners, then yeah, you probably don't need to. Okay. Mm-hmm. Okay. Mm-hmm. Okay, so most of you guys do it informally, is that correct? Aha. Okay. I see a lot of almost informally or reviews. Okay, we've got Cherry who does it every 3 classes. That's really interesting. Would you mind putting it in the chat, and we'll look at it later on how you do it, manage to do it every 3 classes. Okay, so everyone's doing it informally. Fantastic, guys, and thanks for the interaction. Could you explain to me how you do it informally, though? Okay, and someone does it every 10 classes. So that's interesting. The need to do it every 10 classes. Okay. So students don't actually want to be assessed, right? So they don't want a diagnostic test and an interim test and also an end of course test. All right, that's fine. That's fantastic. So how do we assess? All right. Because even though it's not formal, we need to do some kind of assessment. Okay. Right. So for those of you who chose C, okay, what's the main reason behind not assessing? Think about that for a minute. Yeah, I get it. Students don't want to be assessed. They want an informal setting, and you do it informally. Right. Do you think that assessments are also not done because of a lack of material to assess, maybe time constraints? Let's get to the root of the problem. Students don't really want to be assessed in class. Okay, let's get to the root of the problem. Let's weed it out so that we can become even more effective here on italki. And as we go through the webinar, I will provide strategies, tools, and methods to address the issues. And I will also love your input. And so we will revisit this at the end of the webinar, so stay tuned. Now, when I say assess, what comes to mind? Please comment in the chat. So when I say assess, I think a lot of people assumed it was formal. Does it have to be formal? Does it have to be a test? Does it have to be, oh, a big scary exam, lots of marking, time wasted. Time wasted. Now, when many of you said that students don't want that formal classroom experience, I think many students also don't want their valuable lesson time to be wasted. This is the opinion held by many students. Assessments are usually not interactive, so students don't see any value behind an assessment. Right. Now, let's talk about the assessment. An assessment details progress, performance, achievements, whether or not a student is experiencing difficulties. For me, this is probably the most important part. And last but not least, is the student on track to achieving his or her goals? So for those not doing formal lessons, more informal tutoring, maybe the goals are not as, I wouldn't say important, but life-changing, okay? They are more flexible. But for test prep students, they have a definite goal. So assessments can be a quick and effective, And I will show you this with my sample test. Now, many of you, I think, assume that assessments will only be done in class, but they can be done in class and out of class. A recording, which is later evaluated for speaking, or a sample of writing, or through a diagnostic test such as italki's True North for students who are not beginner, but you really want to ascertain their true level. So now that we've understood what an assessment is, I hope you can see that it's an integral, I hope that you can see the integral part it plays in the learning journey. The student has been given a map, but from time to time, we as educators need to check that the student has not gone off course, okay? The student is not lost in the woods somewhere. And if the student is struggling, an assessment, formal or informal, is a warning sign that allows the teacher to change course to address the student's needs, which is what we offer on italki with one-to-one tutoring. Because it's one-to-one tutoring, I have to say this, we are held to a higher standard of accountability because we are catering to the individual. Okay, now let's look at the next slide. And for me, this is an interesting concept. Just because we are teaching does not mean that the student is learning. Have you ever had an experience when you really thought, you really believed that the student had understood the material? You were 100% sure that the student had understood, only to later find out that the student hadn't. I'm willing to bet that this has happened to all of us a few times. Now think about this. Would an interim assessment have helped in this instance? Do you think that an interim assessment would have alerted you to the fact that the student did not fully grasp the material? So the assessment would alert you to this sooner rather than later. And feel free to disagree and tell me why, but I'd love you to comment about this in the chat. Okay, so Charlotte uses error feedback, okay. And you update this every lesson or every second lesson. Fantastic, Charlotte. So we're going to do a little bit of that later. Fabulous. Okay, and for diagnostic tests, yes, Charlotte agrees that the interim assessment, perfect, is definitely a good idea. You catch those problems sooner rather than later, rather than falling through the net. I love that image, okay. Aha, Vanessa, fantastic question. Is anyone willing to respond to Vanessa, or perhaps we could deal with that at the end? Because I am going to discuss this, but it's really interesting concept. Formal assessments could actually, scare the shy students off. Very, very nice. Okay, so Vanessa speaks from personal experience. Fabulous. And the Oxford placement test. Okay. Right. Exactly, Charlotte. Yes, we can disguise the testing. We're professionals. We know how to do it. Good job. Concept checking and assessment. Right. So British English lessons. Okay, we are on the CELTA page. Okay, yes. Yes, perfect. Okay, great, guys. Thank you for all of that interaction. Right. So basically, the burning question is what is being taught being learned, or are you racing through quantity? And there is pressure from students to speed things up while sacrificing the quality of learning. Students are obsessed with moving up from pre-intermediate to intermediate to advanced when they haven't actually mastered the content. And in my opinion, the only way to know that the material being taught is actually being learned is through assessing students. If you have any other suggestions, informal ways, hidden ways of assessing, please add them in the chat and we will discuss them at the end of the webinar. Now, I have mentioned the 4 different types of tests briefly, but we're going to go into detail. So we're talking first about the formative or interim tests, which can be formal or informal, done during the course. And the aim is to modify teaching and learning activities. Students learn in different ways. Perhaps the method that you are using to teach something simply isn't working. So, as teachers, we are able to modify how we teach, adapt it to how the student learns, provide learning activities that resonate with the student, because the ultimate goal is to improve learning and to accelerate learning. Now, the diagnostic tests, many students enroll for IELTS or PTE. So, like I said, they assume they B1, and as such, they truly 100% believe that they will score band 7. A diagnostic test is objective. And the reality is that the objective diagnostic test will often show that they are below what they think or perceive they are in one or more areas, perhaps reading or writing. Okay, very often with IELTS students, we deal with speaking or with writing, but we don't look at the reading or listening. And a diagnostic test will highlight the areas of weakness. So where they fell short, of B1, for example. So perhaps in some skills they were B1, but in others they were not. Now, this affords them the opportunity to work on those areas in a systematic manner, addressing the areas of weakness, and thereby setting themselves up for success. You know, we are committed to providing students with the skills they need. And knowing where they are starting from is paramount. My advice is spend your money wisely, take the test. The italki True North test, and someone mentioned another test. These tests are worth their weight in gold, or the cost of a lesson with a qualified tutor. It will save the student time and angst. Now let's talk about in-class error corrections. And someone mentioned that in the chat. I will go back and have a look at it later. Guys, if you have any comments, anything to add, anything to help all of us to be better, please put it in the chat. So in-class error corrections, hot correction and delayed error correction. So for our CELTA teachers, delayed error correction, you'd be familiar with this. So in your opinion, are either of these in-class corrections, the hot correction or the delayed error correction, effective? And if yes, why? If you can share that in the chat. Also, how you do delayed error correction, and if you could tell me how many minutes you dedicate to delayed error correction in, let's say, a 60-minute class. Let's just make it uniform. So in a 60-minute class, how many minutes do you dedicate to delayed error correction, and how do you do it? So I'm going to go back to our StreamYard and see what you guys have to say. All right. Okay, so conversational assessment is really good. Yeah, and I think it's less intimidating. Okay, so in the first lesson, asking students to just introduce themselves and assess their grammar and vocabulary. Great. Mm-hmm. Okay. Okay, guys. Now we've got to move along so we can get through everything. Right, so for teachers who've not done delayed error correction, I think it's an integral part of the lesson. It's not an add-on, but rather teaching what needs to be taught. So what do I mean? When a student makes an error, the student needs to be corrected before the mistake becomes fossilized and in their minds actually acceptable. So based on personal experience, I can vouch for the fact that it is easier to correct a student at the start of their learning journey than to try and make changes once those errors become a part of who they are as language learners. It's actually easier to teach beginners than to correct advanced learners. Now, in addition, I support the less is more ideology. And by this, I mean that not every error needs to be discussed or analyzed or corrected. So how do you choose? Any ideas, please comment in the chat. Right. In the interest of time, we're going to move fast through this. We'll move quickly through this. So repeated errors, so they don't become fossilized. Errors which are related to content taught in that class, and errors which are made by many students. We don't have the situation at italki, so in group classes. So if a grammar form has been taught in class and the student is making errors or mistakes with the usage, it's our responsibility to correct it so that effective learning and teaching can take place. Now, we get to the really interesting part. In this webinar, we are going to focus on speaking assessments, the tools and strategies we can use to provide effective assessments in and out of the classroom. Having said that, in the latter part of the webinar, assessment aids and suggestions for reading, writing, and listening will be provided. So, when doing a speaking assessment, what criteria would you use or what criteria do you use? You can put that into the chat. Okay, we really want to finish up on time so that we can take all of your questions and answers. So what criteria do you guys use for speaking? Do we have any comments that I can just have a look at quickly? Okay, great. Highlight. Common mistakes made in certain languages. Okay, right, great. I think there's slight delay. So what criteria would you use? Yes, pronunciation, absolutely. Grammar, pronunciation. Okay, yes, but not every time. What other criteria would you use for speaking assessments, guys? For speaking assessments. Pronunciation, rhythm, connected speech, word stress, fabulous. Fabulous. Anything else? Aha, mistakes in pronunciation, that changed the meaning. Fluency, fantastic. So, where, using expressions, great. Where, listening comprehension. Wow, you guys are fantastic. Okay, keep going. Coherence. Sentence structure, fluency, yes. Anything else? Okay, let's see what I have to share with you. Right. So when it comes to a speaking assessment, we really need to be clear about what we're going to assess. And the main criteria for speaking assessments are pronunciation. And I paid particular attention to this and fluency when I'm doing speaking assessments because they cannot be assessed in any other skill. Then we have grammatical range and accuracy. We have lexical resource. That's the last one. So lexical resource, fancy term for your vocabulary. If you are unclear about what each of these means, stay tuned. I'm going to go through all of them with you in detail. And then you may use the criteria to assess my student and see whether I did a good job or not. So in order to assess, we first need to set a task, right? A speaking task. Do you have any ideas or suggestions on what would be an effective speaking task? And if you could share those that you use in your class when you assess speaking, that would be really helpful, because sometimes it seems like we just have the same task that we use over and over again, and it gets boring. And hey, if someone can give us something new and liven things up, that would really be appreciated. So if you guys can comment and help us out with some new, innovative, fun activities we can use to assess speaking, we'll look at that in the chat, okay? So based on this, what tasks would be best suited to an assessment? Okay, a discussion based on a certain topic. Very good. Debate topics, yes, no, pros, cons, role play. Fantastic, Julia. Present images and ask them to verbally describe it. That's what we are going to use. You and I are on the same page. Anything else, guys? So you ask your students, okay, to ask you 50 questions. Okay. Tell me about a trip or a holiday using past tense. Fantastic, because that is a current topic. It's an everyday topic. And you're also asking them to use a particular grammar form. Fabulous. Right? Asking them to describe images. Could Cherry please explain to us what a sushi train game is? That sounds amazing. It sounds really interesting. IELTS speaking practice test. Absolutely, Charlotte. They're about everyday topics. And okay, so they want to do a prep reading, for example. We're going to talk about this. So when you say a prep reading, do you mean a read aloud? Speak about your week. Oh, fabulous. Hear about the past, the present, and the future. All right. Videos, ask them to summarize what they've watched. Read a short text. That will assess pronunciation. Absolutely. Okay, and then summarize it in 3 sentences. Now, that is a fantastic tip. I actually did not think about that. You see, while I'm teaching, I'm learning, and I'm always open to learning. Right, guys? So this is what would be effective. All right, activities where students speak about themselves or an interesting activity. Now, reading text, I said, no, this would not. Don't use read aloud, since we want to assess pronunciation, fluency, grammar, and lexis. Read aloud is not an effective assessment tool. But based on the comment I just saw, I am happy to and really willing to change my opinion. Because if the student does read aloud, that would assess pronunciation and fluency, intonation, pausing, okay. Not grammar and lexis, but I'm not sure who it was who suggested that they then summarize what they've read in 3 sentences. Now, this would address grammar. And if you ask them to summarize it in their own words, you will be activating Lexus. So thank you for that. I'm going to add that in. Okay, so ignore the slide. We've learned a new strategy. Right. So the different types of speaking tasks, speaking assessment tests, depending on the number of students I have to assess and what I am assessing, I use one of these four: an interview, a presentation, an interactive task where two students solve a problem or discuss an issue. For larger groups, a group discussion would work. We don't really do that on italki. Now, someone mentioned debates, and I actually only thought about this last night, pretty late last night. What about debates? Is anyone in favor of debates for ESL students? Personally, for me, this one is a little tricky because unless the student is, or the students, all of the students in that group are advanced and have been taught the relevant debating structures and vocabulary, this is a tough ask in any language. But if you have suggestions on how to do it effectively, I'm ready to listen, okay? In addition, the preparation time would be longer. I suppose the students could prepare before class. But personally, for me, one of my requirements here is to keep the assessment time to a minimum. So if there are ways that you can suggest for us to use debates effectively, I'm all ears. Please just comment in the chat. We can discuss it during our Q&A. We can debate it. Okay, but like I said, if you can show me a way to do it, I'm happy to, just like with the read aloud, fabulous suggestion. Now let's take a look at the settings used for an assessment. Live in a classroom in the good old days when we were all in classrooms. Recorded and evaluated later, which is what I did in the test sample, and online in our italki classes using a computer, a tablet, or a phone. Now, the recorded test, okay. By recording the speaking test and evaluating it later, classroom time is not lost. Students have a real issue with this. The student does not feel cheated of lesson time. You know, it's really difficult to overcome this misconception that so many students have that an assessment or a test is a waste of valuable interaction time. Recording and assessing it later can help overcome this prejudice while allowing the teacher to assess the student and thereby assist them in meeting their goals. Now, some of you are thinking, right, so I'm supposed to do this after class and I'm not getting paid for it. NAS obviously has lots and lots of extra time. Well, you don't have to do it every lesson. And I'm going to show you how you can do it in 10 minutes or under. That's why we're doing this webinar. All right. Now, let's talk about how you're going to rate the student. You need a rating scale. As a test prep specialist, I use the IELTS criteria. I use the IELTS grading. However, you are free to use any numbered rating system. Sometimes not even a rating system, a numbered rating system. Sometimes you can use the Justin Bieber system. Let me tell you about this. I had a mixed group a few years ago in Istanbul, and it was kind of challenging because I had two English teachers from the American college. No, sorry, one was maths, one was English from the American college, and they had to take IELTS tests. And I had a student probably the last year of high school. And I needed to assess them. And it was a really mixed group. So I assign the name of a singer to each grade. Okay, so instead of IL6, we kind of made that one Justin Bieber. Now, this proved to be a fun and less judgmental way of assessing students, even though they were being assessed. So these more mature teachers did not feel awkward or as though they were being judged by a younger student. You've really got to manage that kind of dynamic. So IELTS Advanced, IELTS 9 is advanced, a true superstar. So Lady Gaga, perhaps. And 5 is B1. So let's take a look at these scales, and you can choose, whichever one you want, as long as you understand it and your students also understand it. Now, before we do my listening sample, my speaking assessment sample, let's look at those different criteria for those of you who are not familiar with it. So what is fluency and coherence? Fluency and coherence is basically how clear and structured the speech is. Now, what can we as teachers do to help improve a student's fluency and coherence score? It's not just about assessing and then, thank you, you're not that great, go away. No, how can we help? We can advise them to use linking words, signposting, extend answers, expand with details, provide examples. Test prep teachers, the IELTS teachers will understand this. Pause when it's appropriate. Stop at the end of sentences. Lexical resource, fancy phrase for vocabulary. Now, how can students improve their lexical resource score? Well, they need to use a wide range of vocabulary. In my opinion, it's imperative that students learn vocabulary in context. I beg students to do this. I hate, and I'll admit it, memorized word lists, because students learn these amazing, fantastic words and have no clue how to use them. In addition, they pronounce them incorrectly because they have just read it off a sheet of paper. Discourage students from talking about the same topics all the time, because this doesn't challenge them. They fall into a comfort zone. They use the same vocabulary. They reach a plateau and they're happy to build a little tent on that plateau and stay there forever. And depending on the student's level, how about some idiomatic language? Idioms and phrasal verbs. I try to introduce at least one idiom per session, and I try to get the student to use it multiple times. I believe that less is more, and for me, precision is important. I believe in quality and not quantity. So when I'm teaching an idiom, I will teach it, provide the meaning, use it in context, ask questions related to it, and so on. Now, pronunciation. This refers to the natural speech pattern that the student exhibits. In order to improve pronunciation skills, the student needs to say the words as clearly as possible. So encourage students to record themselves. I hate doing this. I hate listening to myself, but it's necessary. Tell them to stress or emphasize words and parts of a sentence correctly. Intonation, the rising and falling pattern of speech, must be addressed, and it's easier to do this from the beginning. And tell the student that, above all, he or she must be easily understood. Exactly, understood, not stood. Pronunciation. Poor pronunciation makes it very difficult for the listener to understand what is being said. Most native speakers, and those are probably going to be the listeners, don't have the ability to surmise, guess, figure out what the speaker with poor pronunciation is trying to say. And let me correct that, not just native speakers, even another ESL student, because they are also affected by their own language. So it's really tough. So when students are learning new words, they must learn how to say them correctly. And words are often pronounced very differently from the way they are written. And I do apologize on behalf of all English people for this. But there are a number of excellent apps that will assist here. And grammar structures, guys. So I want to just pop into the chat quickly and see you guys. And do you have any suggestions for some grammar structures that students can use to improve the score for grammatical range and accuracy? So let's pop back into the chat box and see some answers. Okay, guys, any? Okay, so using past, present perfect, all right. Great. So how can we, what grammar structures can we teach them or introduce them to improve their scores? So I ask students to compose complete sentences and write them in the Skype chat. Great. All right. So we could suggest using direct speech, different tenses, perhaps conditionals. Anything else, please add it in the chat. Now we're going to look at a sample test in detail. And the task was for the student to describe an image. The test will be recorded or was recorded and evaluated later. The student is graded according to the criteria I've just covered. And the student was provided with a written feedback report. And if anyone would like a copy of my feedback report, which you can amend to suit your style or your purposes, please request it from the team. Now let's move on to the actual assessment. It's an interview with a student and a test taker or the examiner. And this is used simply because I think this is what we do in most of our classes, work one-to-one. And I'm going to use one of these tasks, okay? I've actually gone with the first one. The second one. Why did I say the first one? The second one, tell a story based on a picture, so a visual prompt. Now, let's look at the image. So in the speaking test, a visual narrative will be used. The student is given a picture, and the student is given 1 to 2 minutes to prepare. My student is C1 to C2. For B1 to C2, I would suggest that the student speak for 2 to 3 minutes. And during the preparation time, the student should try to generate language, vocabulary, grammar structures, and so on. Now, do you guys think that providing a visual is effective? What's the purpose of providing a visual? Is it even necessary? Okay, so providing a visual for the narrative is helpful in my opinion, as it enables the speaker to focus on language rather than creating a scenario. Many students lack imagination. They're not always able to visualize scenes, and we're not testing imagination. So providing props is really useful. We refer to it as scaffolding. We provide structures to help, or we provide tools to help the student succeed. So we really want them to succeed. We want to assess whether what they have learned or whether they have learned what we've been teaching. So I don't want to put any extra stress on them. I don't want to put obstacles in their path. I believe that providing a visual takes some of the stress away and it enables them to perform at their peak. So a set of prompts are also used to assist students. This is in line with what we do with the IELTS exam. The prompts help them to generate language. They do not have to answer every question. So I like to refer to them as scaffolding as per the CELTA methodology. So providing a visual or even providing prompts to help students. Tell me what you think, okay? And I'm going to just have a look in the chat. There's lots of new comments. Okay, yes, perfect. Yes, it does take the pressure off the student, doesn't it? Real life photos. Okay, I like that, Vanessa. Thank you. Thank you. That's great. That's great. Mariano, that's a really interesting question. What do you guys think? What do you guys think about just getting them to talk right away? That prevents them overthinking? Or do you think that they need a minute or two to prepare? What do you guys think? What's your view on it? That's really interesting. So it's a great tool. Yeah, you use it from time to time. I have a colleague in Istanbul who used to toss 3 or 4 pictures together and ask students to create something out of it. Okay, so it's a great method. Okay. So do you guys think that advanced students shouldn't be given a visual or prompt? It depends on the level, all right? I'm with you guys. That's great. But this idea about not giving students preparation time, is that a good thing or a bad thing? Would you guys be interested in trying that? Has anyone tried that and is it effective? All right, depends on the student's level. Someone to talk instantly, immediately, okay. Right. Okay, so that's it. We're working with individual students, so we have to adapt. Fabulous, guys. All right. So now we're going to look at the sample test, and based on the criteria, if you guys can maybe make notes of the errors, suggestions, what you would put in a feedback report, and then we'll do mine. All right, guys, ready? I'm going to start the audio. I hope you can hear me. Oh dear, okay, 1 second, please. We're having a problem with the audio file. italki, are we able to open the audio file from our Google Drive? Because it's not opening here. Okay, if you guys can just help me with the audio file, please, because sorry guys, sorry for this technical difficulty here. Yes, I think we're having a problem because we need to open it in StreamYard. Guys, if you can just give me 1 minute. Sorry about this.
The scene describes an accident involving a kid which was skateboarding. And at the scene, there is an ambulance with a couple of paramedics. One of them is attending the kid that apparently fell on the road, and the paramedic has already bandaged the injured leg. But the face of the kid is not suffering, so probably it was a minor injury and the kid is already recovering. There's another person at the scene that seems to comforting the kid. We don't know if he's a father or just a passing by person. And there is another little girl with kick scooter. Probably he was going with his friend, with the skateboarding friend when the accident came. It's not clear how the accident happened. If the kid fell on the road by himself, or he was knocked down by a car or by a bicycle or another pedestrian. But it doesn't seem to be a very serious accident. That the area seems a tranquil neighbor, a residence neighbor. There is a person, a woman, looking out of the window at the scene of the accident, and I think what will happen next, that the kid maybe is going to be transported to the hospital for further checks, or maybe is going to let go home by himself because the injury is not so serious. It's not clear. Or maybe his or her father will come to fetch him and take home with him.
Okay, were you guys able to hear that? Okay, can everyone hear me? If someone can just comment in the chat that you can. Okay, so based on that, okay, what kind of feedback would you give? What kind of feedback would you give? So my student was asked to record his speech and send it via email. It was assessed out of class. To be honest, when I listened to the recording and I assessed it and filled out the feedback form and emailed it to the student, it took less than 10 minutes. I'm going to show you how, because this is important. We often think that these assessments are going to take a lot of time. And as someone suggested, they can be done every 10th lesson. So 10 minutes every 10th lesson is not too much. So, right, when you were listening to the recording, did the student avoid silences and hesitations? Did the student speak at length? Did the student use words and connectors to connect ideas? And did the student pronounce the words accurately did the student join words together? And how about varied intonation? Did the student use idioms and collocations? What about paraphrasing? And did the student use a wide range of vocabulary also with precision? It's important that students use words correctly. Did the students speak in complex sentences, or were all of the sentences really very basic? Were the tenses correct? Did the student use a variety of grammatical forms? Were there any grammar errors? So if you consider all of those, okay, how would you assess the student? Now, before I go back to the comments and see what you guys have to say about the student who was not prompted, not tutored, or guided on how to answer this, it was a real assessment. I have to say that what's interesting to note is that pre-assessment, I had become so accustomed to some of the errors, because this is a long-term student, that I'd stopped pointing them out. And as such, it's clear that assessments, even if the student is doing it to help me with my webinar, helps both the teacher and the student. So look at the criteria and you tell me how you would have rated the student, right? I've used a feedback form, which I created with the help of some of the guys at italki to make notes of errors. And it's important to note that feedback works when it's frequent, when it's timely, when it's sufficient enough, not too much, not too little, and it's detailed enough. Feedback also needs to be linked to the purpose of the assessment task and the criteria. The feedback needs to be understandable. What do I mean by this? We have to take the student's level of language sophistication into account. So I cannot provide feedback using C2 language with a pre-int student or a B1 student. So give feedback that the student can understand. We want the student to understand the feedback. The feedback's going to help with progress. And feedback should really focus on learning and improvement rather than marks. And in my opinion, really written feedback using the template feedback, which I've used, reduces time. It's really effective because it gives the student and the teacher time to reflect. So we're going to look at my assessment, but I'm just going to have a look quickly in the chat to see if you guys have put anything. No, we're running out of time. So during the Q&A, I'll look at your comments. So let's look at my assessment and how did it compare to yours? Did having the criteria help you to assess more easily? And if you guys want the feedback report, just contact the team and it will be emailed to you. So once again, written feedback as opposed to oral feedback is that the student has more time to understand and take in and reflect on their strengths and their weaknesses. You know, with oral feedback, some students may only hear, yay, 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 only the positives. I'm great. Oh, I'm amazing. That's what my tutor said. And some may only hear the corrections and the critique. So a report gives a detailed analysis and allows the student to truly reflect on the corrections and suggestions in a quiet, private space. Now, in the assessment on lexical resource and grammar, I've made detailed notes stating the errors as well as the correct usage. And I sometimes suggest worksheets that students can use to improve grammar where they've been making mistakes. So would you agree that the student will benefit more from the written feedback than the oral feedback? Now, in addition to pointing out errors, provide suggestions for vocabulary and grammar to help the student improve. This is a little extra. When doing this, keep them to a maximum of 3 to 5 so that the student is not overwhelmed. I've gone overboard here with 9 because I'm working with a very advanced learner who likes being challenged and is a really long-term student. But recently, I had a student complain that a teacher refused to correct every one of her errors. And this is what she wanted. Do you agree or disagree? Should we correct every single error? And I tried to convince her. It took about 5 minutes to try to convince her. And I will keep saying try to convince her because I'm not sure that I succeeded. That every error should not be corrected by a teacher. Professional teachers, our CELTA graduates will know that we need to highlight errors which are repeated or linked to the material taught. The student wanted every error corrected. I don't think she would have been able to handle the number of corrections. It would have seriously destroyed her self-confidence, and students don't always realize that. So what's your view on it? Now, please write that in the chat. We'll discuss it during the Q&A. Okay, now, there were many reasons stated at the beginning about why teachers don't do assessments. Based on the sample test, I hope that I've shown how assessments can be done without losing class time and done effectively using the correct material as well as a standardized grading system. And I promised italki I would cover the other skills, so I'm going to do it very quickly. Okay. Listening. Why do we need to assess listening? Comment in the chat, but I'm going to kind of race through it. It gives us valuable information about what students are actually able to hear in terms of phonics, in terms of vocabulary, in terms of sentence structure and instructions. And if you had to assess listening, what tools would you use? Please comment. As they say, sharing is caring. And it's often that when we share, we learn about new methods. All right. So I have some suggestions, but I want to hear what you guys have to add. So dictation, closed exercises, games, bingo. Yep. Minimal pairs, tongue twisters, debates for higher level students. And we're going to talk maybe a little bit about how we can do that effectively. Now, reading. Oh, how do we assess reading? I just have a few suggestions. Does the student read words? Or is the student reading phrases? So that's how I assess reading. Is the student reading individual words, or is the student reading phrases and chunking? Is the meaning of the author understood? If you read words as opposed to phrases, the meaning is lost, right? Think about phrasal verbs or idioms. So if the student is reading single words, how does that affect the meaning in terms of, like I said, phrasal verbs or idioms? And if the student is reading large, meaningful phrase groups, does this have a positive effect on interpretation? This is where the IELTS students who score well, they understand this concept. You have to read in phrases, in chunks. Does anyone else have anything to add? And what are some methods we can use to assess reading? So journaling, reading response notebooks, draw a picture based on what you read, acting out, open book assessments, and so on. Now, writing, this may be easier because I think lots of us assess writing. How do you assess writing? What criteria do you use? Just a little word of advice when setting writing tasks. So if you're not using IELTS questions, if you are setting your own writing task, keep the questions as short and simple as possible. We're not trying to confuse the student. And try to limit each question to one task. For essay assessments, write an essay, write a response to a letter, and so on. So basically, assessments work in multiple ways. They give us a clear indication of how effective our teaching methods were with the student, how much learning took place, and what needs to be changed to improve the process of teaching and learning. So I hope that this webinar has convinced you of the need for effective assessments and shown you how easily they can be done in 10 minutes using our feedback form. Okay, so once again, you can use professional tests to assess a student's level. The italki North Star, it gives students a true reflection of their abilities, paving the way for a clear learning strategy. And I think it's now time for Q&A with Nas. Time for you guys to grill me. Okay, guys, do you have any questions? I'm just going to look at some of the questions. All right, so perfect. Yes, true or false for the reading. Yes. Okay, so assessing writing can be difficult. Anyone have suggestions on how to assess writing? I've given you a few tasks that you could set, and then using the criteria, you can assess students. I think here particularly the IELTS writing criteria, the public rating system is really very helpful. Let me see. Okay. Uh-huh. Okay, so I have convinced Anzor that assessments work. If I've convinced one person, that's enough. Uh-huh. Okay, so focus on just one or two aspects. Yes, that's absolutely correct. Okay, guys, Q&A time. Uh-huh. Oh, Charlotte, thank you so much, and thank you for your interaction. I'm just going to scroll backwards to see if I've missed anything or there's something really important we should discuss. Okay, so Anne is helping a student with the pronunciation patterns, right? And it's difficult for the student to hear or improve, and even though he's very motivated and is focused on a pronunciation class. Okay, so the student cannot actually hear his own mistakes. So I suppose here, with the SALTA methodology, drilling would probably be the most effective. Just keep drilling. Also try to identify what the pronunciation issue is. Is there some kind of L1 interference? So does it have something to do with their first language interference? Is it a particular sound? Maybe go through the phonetic chart with the student, try some tongue twisters, and probably just repeat, even though it might seem tiresome, but we need to undo the problem. All right. Let me just have a look here. More comments. Okay, yeah, you guys want the feedback form, so shout out to Kitty at italki if you could provide the feedback form. It was actually Kitty who helped me to create it, so thank you, Kitty. And yeah, I think if you guys just send a message to italki, they would help you. They'll send you the feedback form, just amend it. Well, the comment on the screen for fluency, there are criteria. Confidence would, in my opinion, it would be how great the student feels after delivering a presentation. And sometimes the first time that you answer a question, and this was actually done in a test center during a teacher training session with us. The first time you answer a question, your answer's good, even as a native speaker and as a teacher, or I would hope. But the second time you do it, it's even better. And the third time, even better. It may seem like a waste of time at the beginning. All of us really qualified, experienced teachers thought this, but by the time we had done the same question answer with 3 different teachers or partners, we saw that we kept adding on, and based on our partner's answer, we added on. We kind of stole some of their vocab. And so by the third time, you feel like, I got this, I'm really good. So if it works for experienced teachers, it's definitely going to help students boost their confidence. So repetition, which is also why I suggested the 1-minute prep time. And if anyone else has any other suggestions, they'd be most welcome. Yeah. Okay. So the feedback form. Okay. Yeah. So if you need the feedback form, contact italki support. We already have it on the drive. It would be quite easy to send to you. Do you guys have any other questions for me? Any other suggestions on how, maybe help me out, any other suggestions on how to assess reading or listening? So IELTS resources, can anyone suggest IELTS resources? I'm not sure whether I should be saying this, but you could follow me. I post IELTS stuff all the time. I also have all of the latest topics. I think that's really important. When the test students come to us, they want the latest material because that's what they're going to be tested on. Will this webinar be saved? I think so. I think it would probably be uploaded to YouTube, but the italki team can assist you with that. I know I went through the last part really quickly, so if you guys have any questions about that, then please let me know. Yes, yes. When we did the COVID lockdown webinars, all of them were uploaded to YouTube. So I'm assuming that the same would happen here. Any other questions? Any other suggestions on how to effectively assess students? Word cube, 6 words at a time. Right. Okay. So Tracy, that's very similar to what my colleague at the test center used to do. It was such fun because he did it with the kiddies class, but we also realized it could work with all levels. He would just grab 4 pictures off the internet, setting action. So you've got descriptive words that you can use, and you've got verbs, and put them together and ask students, well, here on italki, we do it alone, but if you've got a group, work together and create a story, and some interesting things come out of it. Yeah. IELTS resources for other languages. IELTS is English, so I think all of the resources are in English. I know there are sites for Chinese and for different Indian languages, but also Arabic. There are lots of Arabic sites. The thing is, if your student is an IELTS student, shouldn't your student be studying in English. That's what we talk about, accelerated learning. Don't rely too much on the first language, on the native language, because eventually, in order to score well with IELTS, the student needs to be thinking in English. That's where the high scores come in. Mass, I think that the link goes up after the webinar. It can't be done, I think, maybe during the webinar, but we'll check with the team. I'm sure they will send a shout out to us. Anything else, guys? The word cube, 6 words at a time. Yep. What about ways to generate a vocabulary? So I said one of the suggestions, you know, how can we improve lexical resource? I don't like wordless. I don't agree with them. So how can we improve students' vocabulary? Also, what are some top tips that you give to your students to improve their English learning journey or any language journey? My top tip is change your Facebook page to English. That way you are reading everything in English, even if it's just the like button or the comment button, you start learning the words. And don't expect to understand everything, okay? But try to also read 1 news article a day. It takes a couple minutes. At the beginning, it might be more difficult. Also, I always say BBC, but BBC, CNN, whatever you like in English. I like BBC. The language is good. It also deals with current events, current topics. So that's very helpful. Okay, and guys, we need to wrap up really soon. Yes, bake using an English recipe. I do that in Italian. I love Italian food. I ask for recipes. I get it in Italian, and then I have to figure it out. Change your phone setting. Yes, when I'm in Italy, the same thing happens. Think in English. Fabulous, guys. Right, so if a student's struggling, then for vocabulary, the student needs to start building up their vocabulary around the topic. And I'm sorry, guys, but I think we are running out of time. So let me just hold on 1 second. Right. So basically, everyone, please reach out to the team via email or italki support if you'd like a copy of my feedback report for speaking, which you can amend to suit your classes. And because you have the report, it takes a couple minutes to fill in and the student will be none the wiser. So thank you for attending this webinar, and I hope that it was useful and informative. It's an added tool that allows you to provide more value to your classes. To everyone who interacted and who shared and who gave us some amazing suggestions, thank you for teaching me today. Stay safe, everyone, and maybe see you soon. Ciao.